welcome back to my series. If you're new here, I'm Lily and I run a micro bakery small business called Lily's Loaf in South London. So welcome back guys, it is a Tuesday morning. I've done all of my bakes, all of my deliveries are done. Today I wanted to dedicate this video to all about caring for and maintaining your sourdough starter. So when I first started making sourdough back in 2011, all those many moons ago, I found all of this stuff really confusing, and genuinely up until maybe 2-3 years ago I still found it pretty confusing. And it's one thing making maybe one loaf a week to going up to making 60 loaves a week, if not more. So I wanted to really simplify caring for your sourdough starter and just making it a bit more accessible if you guys are having trouble with this, because I know how overly complicated it can get. So I've written a few notes and hopefully you find this useful. So the first starter that I ever made was back in 2011, and I believe I made that with some strong white flour and a few organic grapes because that's what the recipe suggested. Because it helps speed up fermentation with all of the different bacteria in there. And just so you're aware, I am much more of like a holistic, intuitive, kind of sensory baker than an overly scientific baker, and some people really go into all the details. And if you want that, maybe go to another channel, maybe go to a different recipe, but I am much more about just like using your senses, kind of figuring out what makes your starter happy, and just going with a few basic principles. My second starter I made at the beginning of Lily's Loaf, if not a little bit earlier, was a 100% whole grain dark rye starter. And I chose rye because I'd heard from a few different bakers that it just generally has more activity, more microbial activity, and it's pretty robust. So when it starts to peak, I think it peaks for a few more hours than say like a 100% white starter, where it will peak quickly and then decrease again in activity. And my current starter, which is here, that I need to feed now, is 50% whole grain wheat and 50% T80 wild farm flour. So it's 100% wild farm flour, and that just means that it is grain that is grown regeneratively. They prioritize soil health, and it's they don't use any herbicides, pesticides or fungicides, and they're just generally caring for the land. Anyway, that is a side point, and we can go into more detail about flour maybe in another video. But this is 50-50 whole grain wheat and 50% like strong white flour essentially. So why I chose to convert to this one is actually an error on my part, because when I went away in the summer for a week, I asked my sister to look after my rye starter and to keep it alive. But I think it was a combination of, it was so hot over here in London last summer, and the starter had kind of been, I don't know, it wasn't that happy in the heat, and also my sister found it quite confusing, and so I just decided to shove it in the fridge. And then when I came back, it was not in a happy place at all, and I tried to revive it, but it wasn't looking too good. It wasn't smelling too good either. So I decided to start anew, and because I had quite a big order the next day, I had to get some sourdough starter from a local baker down the road, which I am so grateful for. And I decided to go 50-50 because I love my whole grains. I'm big into the flavour of whole grains, and just generally they are good for you, so I'm told. But I really love like the depth of flavour that a little whole grain brings into bread and just products in general. And also because I did a bakery stage at Ursa Minor Bakehouse in Ballycastle, and they always did 50-50, whole grain and T80. So I really love their bread. I really admire all of their work that they do there. And I thought, well, this could be a nice fresh start. So that is the reasoning behind my 50-50. Kind of best of both, because I feel like white starters can generally be on the sweeter side and like kind of milkier flavors, whereas the whole grain brings a little more something else, like another flavor profile. And that's also why I love dark rye too. And I feel like dark rye works especially well when you are mixing it with a strong white bread flour. So say if you've got 100% dark rye and then you're mixing it into a predominantly white loaf, it just has like a whole other dimension, which is just so good. And that is also why I use dark rye in my loaves right now. But from what I've learned over the past few years is whenever you bring in some sort of whole grain, they do bring in a whole new species of bacteria, and it can be pretty lively and active in there. So it's just something to be wary of. And some people even have multiple starters, but for me, one starter is enough with all of my other products and things going on. So my two main tips when it comes to sourdough starters that I would give to anybody asking me for advice, especially if you're scaling up from one loaf to multiple loaves, if you're running micro bakeries or some sort of small bakery business, is get yourself onto foodgeek, food starter calculator. I use this every week, and one baker friend of mine suggested it to me, and it's changed my life. It's amazing. It really helps you understand, say if you need, I don't know, X amount of sourdough starter for your loaves, this will figure out how much you need to feed it and at what ratio as well you want. So that is like my number one tip in terms of scaling up your sourdough starter. And the second tip is something that I learned from another baker, Ian Lowe, A Piece of Bread on Instagram, and he said minimise variation. And at first I thought, okay, what does that mean? But he went on to explain it, and it basically means like, so he will feed his starter twice a day, every day. And that means that it's in a routine and it understands like when it's being fed, and it's much more reliable than say if you were to feed it once or twice a week but keep it in the fridge for days when you're not using it. So it completely depends like what sort of baker you are, if you're baking every single day, if you're baking once a week. But I have taken grains of advice from all sorts of different bakers and have kind of tweaked it to work in with my own production schedule. So personally, what I will do is I will build this as and when I need it. So say if I've got a prep day the next day, I will take out a little bit of this and then I will feed it to either a 1:3:3 ratio or a 1:5:5 ratio. And I'll feed it roughly at like 5:30 in the evening. The night before I'll be mixing it at 5 a.m. the next day. And the higher ratios you go, the less sourdough starter you need and the more flour it will be eating through, so it will peak at a lower rate. So like the higher the ratio, the longer it will take to peak, and that as a baker is quite handy, especially if you are running a busy bakery and if you're making lots of different products. On the other hand, some bakers may come in and feed the starter first thing and then only start mixing it 3 hours later. I used to do this at the beginning of Lily's Loaf, but I found things were just taking too long and I wanted to really get the mix going as soon as I started my working day. Because if you think about it, it'll add 3 hours onto your day. Now, there are pros and cons of doing this, because if you're feeding it at a higher ratio, the flavour may not be as good as, say, if you're feeding it at a lower ratio, so you're using a younger starter and you fed it on the morning of your mixing it. But you've got to bear in mind that, you know, there are so many other things that you need to be getting on with in the day. And in an ideal world, I would probably feed it 3 hours before mixing, and it would probably make the bread better. And this is something that I learned that Josie Baker, who's based out in San Francisco, him and his team will start their days earlier because they know that it will make the bread better. So I guess it just depends what you want. So if you're a home baker, then absolutely you could do that. But for me, I tend to feed it the evening before I am mixing it, and it works well for me. I realise I'm kind of jumping all over the place here, but hopefully you're staying with me and hopefully it's clear. So when I did my bakery stage at Ursa Minor, what they did is they always kept back at least a tablespoon, and then they would just feed that tablespoon with however much starter they needed for their loaves the next day. So that's all they would keep. So say if they've mixed the starter in a big container, they would then take out 1 tablespoon of that and put it back in a clean, small container like this. And this is a version of what I do now, actually. They'll keep that in there, and then at the end of the working day, they will feed that in the big container and grow it again. Okay, so because tomorrow isn't a sourdough prep day for me, I am just feeding this just to maintain the starter. And what I do is, when I am discarding excess sourdough, I will put it in a bowl like this, and then I'll use this. I'll keep on adding to this for a few days, say, and I will use this for sourdough crackers, and I then sell them, so I call them my zero waste sourdough crackers, and they're so good. I eat them every day. So I end up not selling loads because I eat them all. But anyway, as you can see in here, I only have about 1 tablespoon left of the sourdough starter, so I will feed this with about 60 grams or 50 grams of whole grain flour, and then 50 grams of T80 or strong white bread flour, 100 grams of water. So that means in this mix I'll probably have about 225, say, grams of mixture, of sourdough mixture. So this means that tomorrow I can build from this, and I will have enough sourdough starter for my loaves to mix and prepare on Thursday. And say if I've made an error, say if I haven't mixed enough sourdough starter here, I can always build it at a higher ratio, and then it will just peak a little bit later. So I will mix this on Wednesday evening at either a 1:3:3 ratio or 1:5:5 ratio. And also my third number 1 tip is to use your hands, because the sourdough starters feed off like live bacteria and wild yeasts. they've done scientific experiments and they often find like the same bacteria, like good bacteria, from bakers' hands in the sourdough starter, so it actually really likes that. So you just have to make sure that it's well mixed, and then I will keep this in the fridge, and a few days later I'll have enough sourdough starter to be able to make some more crackers with. So that is essentially how I care for my starter. I hope that made sense, guys. Leave me a comment down below if anything doesn't make sense, but I feel like I've kind of gotten to grips with it, and it doesn't have to be overly complicated. If you are a home baker, you can just like leave it in the fridge for the majority of the week, and then I would give it a couple feeds before you're making your sourdough the next day. But if you are running a micro bakery, I would say feed it most days, but like for me, for example, it gets to Friday night and I won't be doing any prep until Monday, so I will put it in the fridge most of the time because I also want to have a break. But obviously when I move into a shop, I'll probably have a different production schedule, so I'll just have to make it work in a way that works for me. So I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. If anything doesn't make sense, I will try my best to get back to you and to help make it clearer for you, but it doesn't have to be complicated, and you can make your sourdough work for you. So yeah, so thank you so much for watching, guys, and I will see you next week for another video. Bye!